Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel 23 are often compared using the image of Jerusalem and Samaria as an adulterous wife, but both chapters are part of a narrative unit that emphasizes judgment within the greater context of the book of Ezekiel. The promise of Israel's redemption inherent in the narrative layers of Ezekiel 16 is, as expected, difficult to locate in Ezekiel 23. Given the literary parallels of Ezekiel 12 to 24 on judgment and Ezekiel 33 to 39 on restoration, a literary comparison of Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel 36 to 37 demonstrates that these chapters are interconnected, particularly along the theme of rehabilitation and regeneration. So this paper will analyze Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel 36 to 37 as a case of interbiblical allusion or resumptive exposition, focusing on how the message of Israel's restoration in Ezekiel 36 to 37 alludes to that of Jerusalem's judgment and rehabilitation in Ezekiel 16. Commentators have identified some lexical and thematic links between Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel 36 to 37. Nevertheless, an integrated study of the chapters along the line of the foundling motif has not been undertaken. Notably, the prophetic condemnation against adulterous Jerusalem in Ezekiel 16 repeatedly points to Yahweh's merciful dealing with Jerusalem in her youth as an exposed orphan and an uncovered virgin. I propose that the ancient Near Eastern literature on the birth ritual and the foundling illuminate the rhetorical underpinning of Ezekiel 16 in this regard. Ezekiel 36 to 37, in conjunction with Ezekiel 16, employ literary reversal and amplification through the deft interweaving of lexical elements to intensify the thrust of Yahweh's message for the eschatological renewal of Israel. Moreover, the water and blood ritual alluded to at the beginning of Yahweh's deliverance of the covenant partner in both chapters is linked with allusions to the priestly texts and written rituals, so that the irony of divine forgiveness for the house of Israel is underscored to our shame. Hence, Ezekiel 16 is a significant conversational companion for comprehending the prophetic discourse in Ezekiel 36 to 37 about Israel's hopeful future. First, a detailed reading of Ezekiel 16 in light of ancient Near Eastern writings provides additional insights into the rhetorical approach of the foundling narrative. As commentators note, washing, oiling, salting, and swaddling the newborn after severing of the umbilical cord is a common practice in the ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean cultures. The mythological rationale behind the birth ritual is manifest in the tradition of Levantine folklore, which most likely reflects the socioeconomic norms behind the text of Ezekiel 16:4. It is said that the midwife bathes the baby and anoints his body with oil in which fine powdered salt has been dissolved, not only to fortify the skin, but also to ward off evil influences, as non-salted children have a weak and silly character. Illegitimate children who are labeled as Ibn Haram or Bandu are deprived of the chance to be salted after birth, and in such a cultural milieu, labeling a person as not salted is considered as an outright insult. Some experts reckon that in the ancient Near Eastern setting, formal acknowledgement of the newborns will take place through postnatal washing, and those who did not receive such a ritual ablution would be made available for adoption by other parties. Remarkably, the Hammurabi Code on primary adoption preserves a specific phrase to refer to the foundling as a child in his/her water and blood. Quote on, if a man adopted a child in his water and has brought him up, that one has been raised shall not be reclaimed. Quote up. As Westbrook and others maintain, the expression its water is a shortened form of its water and blood, the ancient parlance of what we know as amniotic fluid, the protective liquid surrounding a fetus during pregnancy. The following excerpt from the cuneiform of Susa illustrates the point. Maniatu, the Istaritu, abandoned Mareshre in his water and blood in order to acquire her property. Neglecting a washing ritual for the newly born infant signifies the biological parent's decisive intent to dispose of the child. The legal implication is that the natural parents are foregoing entirely rights associated with the foundling's parenthood, and as a result, any potential adoptive would assume the primary status of the adoptee's guardianship. Such measures secure the primary parental rights of adoptive parents, potentially judicial officials or temple functionaries who remain celibate should the natural parents attempt to reclaim their child later. According to Yahweh's description of Jerusalem's infancy in Ezekiel 16:5, Jerusalem did not evoke anyone's pity to the extent that no one was willing to perform the birth ritual out of compassion. She was instead cast out into the open field because she was abhorrent from the moment she was born. It is quite apparent from Ezekiel's metaphoric narrative that the parents did not accidentally lose her or had to abandon her because of extenuating circumstances. Rather, the baby was simply cast outside the city wall in the pasture land because she repulsed them. That no eyes pitied her to take the appropriate measures to perform the birth ritual, as in verse 5, implies that not even adoptive parents were available to rear her and indicates the direness of her adversity. The usage of the particular term, open field, is remarkable because the priestly tradition occasionally appropriates the phrase in the sense of removing contamination involving water and or blood as an instrument of ritual mediation. The basis of parents' loathing of the newborn child is not clear from the text, although the author's choice of the term may imply that their antipathy is based on the malevolent potency of the child's intrinsic defilement. Whether the banishment was due to undesirable physical or gender traits or innate abnormalities, the severity of parents' rejection recalls the Babylonian practice of discarding a hideous or monstrous child or cattle and the accompanying riddance ritual. If a baby was born with defective features, for example, the Babylonians took it as an omen of impending evil, and pertinent ritual remedies were administered for the parents to ward off the foreboding evil, leading to the abandoning of the deformed baby in the water. The parent of the baby to be disposed of first engages in reciting incantations addressed to Shamash, the sun god, and Naru, the river god, 3 times each to deflect the looming evil forces. The finale of the incantation ritual is graced with a sincere petition for the parent's protection from evil and his own vitality. By the command of Ea and Asal, he remove that evil. May your banks release it. Take it down to your debts. Extract that evil. You full of laughter, grant me life. The malformed child is then dropped into the river, which in the Babylonian context is a location of ceremonial catharsis for discarding defilement, along with purging flora believed to have purifying effects. In Ezekiel 16:6-7, we find a subtle point of reversal in the case of Jerusalem, which Yahweh observes as she rides in her own blood in an open field. In the Babylonian context, the owner of a foundling pleaded for his life to the river deity before disposing the unwanted baby into the river. Nonetheless, in the oracular parable of Ezekiel, Yahweh declares life to the rejected foundling. The threefold repetition of "in your blood" is interlaced with the 2 imperatives: live, the juxtaposition of the image of Jerusalem bathed in her own blood against that of Yahweh's command for her to live engenders a portrait of regeneration analogous to the creation account of Genesis. Just as the Lord God breathed life into Adam's nostrils so that he became a living being, Yahweh's word of life infuses a miraculous transformation of the foundling's moribund state. The recreation transpires as near-death child flourishes like a plant of the field, signifying figuratively divine deliverance, equivalent to the requisite birth ritual for an infant's survival. The imagery associated with the rejuvenation of the baby girl into an adult lady with flowering physical characteristics is reminiscent of a well-watered plant on riverside. In the Babylonian case, the foundling drowns in the water, whereas in the Ezekielian tradition, she thrives through its supply. Like a source of living water, Yahweh's creative proclamation nurtures and empowers the girl to reach womanhood as she grows tall and yields exquisite adornment of the adornments. In Ezekiel 36 and 37, Ezekiel announces promises of Israel's renewal, restating and expounding strands of earlier irregular utterances with additional details. Of our particular interest is the ways in which Ezekiel 16 is reappropriated and developed in these chapters, especially the use of water and blood imagery. Ezekiel chapter 36. Ezekiel begins chapter 36 by recapitulating the principal sins of Israel, using the metaphor of a defiled menstruant, which are allegedly the basis for Yahweh's punishment against Jerusalem in Ezekiel 16. The literary reformulation in Ezekiel 36 is attained by distinctively blending various strands of literary elements from Ezekiel 16 with the cumulative impact of projecting the house of Israel as Yahweh's beautiful wife in her youth. For instance, Ezekiel 36 and Ezekiel 16 both contain the unique word former, state, time, which connects the two chapters by way of underlining the idyllic past of Yahweh's covenantal partners. Also, the verb multiply, which is first deployed to delineate Yahweh's merciful deliverance of Jerusalem, is appropriated in the description of Jerusalem's wanton debauchery in Ezekiel 16, and it is used with a reverse effect to emphasize the promise of renewal for Israel in Ezekiel 36. In the paradisiacal state of Eden. The verb know, used in the formula for Yahweh's self-recognition in Ezekiel 16, is broadened in Ezekiel 37 to encompass the surrounding nations that taunted Israel. Notably, Ezekiel 36:17 compares Israel's spiritual corruption to like the uncleanness of a woman in her menstrual impurity. Although the explicit mention of the phrase is not found in Ezekiel 16, Jerusalem's ritual defilement through adultery with male images in the chapter alludes to profuse bodily discharges during her arousal, of which some scholars do not preclude the possibility of the blood from menstruation. The imagery of Jerusalem's lust being poured out dovetails with that of the woman of Jerusalem pouring out the blood of innocent children in Ezekiel 16. In fact, the verb pour out is repeated several times in chapter 16 in the context of underlining Jerusalem's wretched promiscuity and violence. Exploiting the verb cues, Ezekiel 36:18 succinctly recaptures the thrust of the longest discourse found in the book of Ezekiel. Jerusalem, the adulterous wife, is punished for her idolatry and bloodshed. Just as she poured out the innocent blood, Yahweh will pour out his wrath upon them. That Yahweh poured out his rage on Israelites in Ezekiel 36, verse 18, corresponds to the expression, I will bring upon you the blood of wrath and jealousy in Ezekiel 16:38. Yahweh foretold of the days when his wrath and his jealousy will be exhausted and withdrawn from Jerusalem in Ezekiel 16. Accordingly, Ezekiel speaks of the prophetic reversal in Ezekiel 36. Yahweh will be vindictive in his jealousy and wrath on behalf of Israel after she has suffered derision among the nations. Ezekiel assumes that God would gather Israel back from the world to their homeland and accomplish a thorough transformation of his people and bless them abundantly. The first phase of the inner restoration will entail purification from uncleanness precipitated by their idolatry. In particular, the imagery of water cleansing in Ezekiel 36:25 has elicited diverse interpretations throughout generations, giving rise to various forms of ablutionary and baptismal rites in Judaism and Christianity. Given Ezekiel's penchant for inter-biblical allusion, it is significant to consider that the terms that evoke the priestly text are interwoven in this particular verse. For instance, the verb to sprinkle, along with the preposition al, in the context of priestly ritual, is generally used in handling blood or sacred compounds symbolic of blood, as attested in Leviticus and Numbers. Most likely, the purification ritual rendered to the house of Israel in Ezekiel 36, as seen in verse 25, alludes to the red heifer ritual involving water of impurity, Menida, for the Israelites. This implies that the clean water mentioned in Ezekiel 36:25 is not to be correlated with the unadulterated water used for ablution or baptism in Judeo-Christian religious practices, later despite their possible reliance on the text. The Hebrew text has other specific terms that may be associated with the pure water utilized in ritual settings such as holy water, mayim kedushim, or fresh water, mayim chayim. It is noteworthy that the mixture of water and the natural components that symbolizes life in blood, though only a trace of it may be, produces lustration effect. This aspect more or less aligns with Yahweh's bathing Jerusalem with water and rinsing her bloodstains in the context of a marriage covenant. Both accounts of purification rites in Ezekiel 16 and 36 are presented at the pivotal juncture of God's intervention to deliver and renew his covenant partner. Both chapters evince that God's merciful regard for the unmerited catalyzes his salvific undertaking. For instance, Yahweh's regard for Jerusalem and for his holy name is accentuated by the verb to spare or to have compassion, followed by the preposition al. In Ezekiel 16:5, the verb to pity and to have compassion in Handai's construction discloses Yahweh's profound benevolence toward the foundling Jerusalem abandoned in an open field. In Ezekiel 36:21, Yahweh promises to act on account of his holy name, not because of Israel. His compassion for the sanctity of his name is aroused as the Israelites, who are called Yahweh's people, ended up desecrating the holy epithet of Yahweh as the pagan nations ridicule Israel's exilic existence among them. Here, the plight of the house of Israel in Ezekiel 36 converges with that of the foundling Jerusalem in Ezekiel 16, in that they are in dire need of salvation from the state of deprivation and alienation. Notably, the word impurity, nida, meaning either menstruation or menstruant throughout the Bible, used in Numbers 19:20, appears in Ezekiel 36:17, which encapsulates the nature of Israel's transgression in the priestly conceptual framework. In Ezekiel 36:17, the expression hanida is variously translated as denoting a menstruant. Hence, when Yahweh enunciates that he will sprinkle water to eliminate all her uncleannesses in Ezekiel 36:25, the lexical correspondence conjures up the priestly cleansing potion mentioned in the red heifer ritual in Numbers 19. In Numbers 19, the so-called water of impurity is the liquid mixture composed of ashes from the red heifer sacrifice with cedar wood, hyssop branches, and crimson thread, each component figuratively representing blood or employed in the blood manipulation for atonement. As part of the riddance ritual, the solution is to be sprinkled upon the ritually defiled person in an open field, as evinced in the books of Leviticus and Numbers. Thus, through the imagery of sprinkling of ritual substance in Numbers 19, Yahweh's initial discovery and purgation of the foundling Jerusalem, who is left unwashed in an open field, wallowing in her own blood, is juxtaposed with Yahweh's sprinkling of the cleansing mixture, that is, water and blood, upon the house of Israel, stained with menstruation, after gathering her from among the nations at the outset of the eschatological renewal. The potency of the purgation elicited by the ritual potion is illustrated also by the ways in which the reiteration of all in modifying your uncleannesses and your idols, the rhetorical emphasis detected in Leviticus 16. Ezekiel's appropriation of the term from Leviticus is apparent, as the term is mostly attested in the book of Leviticus to connote sins in ethical and ritual contexts. Ezekiel's employment of the distinctive noun in the backdrop of the Day of Atonement, Ezekiel 36:25, is theologically meaningful. Just as Israel's forgiveness, despite her utter failure as a covenant partner, is definitively declared solely based on Yahweh's grace and mercy on the Day of Atonement, Yahweh will ultimately cleanse the house of Israel from all her uncleannesses through the sprinkling of clean water upon her. In this way, Yahweh's provision of cleansing derived from the sacrificial blood will effectively undo even the vilest form of human sins as metaphorically expressed in the woman's bodily discharge. The import of this imagery overlap is the fulfillment of God's commitment to remember his covenant with Jerusalem established in the days of her youth by entering with her in an everlasting covenant. Its rhetorical impact is realized in the paradoxical turnaround of Jerusalem's law. While Jerusalem failed to remember the days of youth, Yahweh remains faithful by remembering the covenant in her days of youth, leaving Jerusalem dumbfounded and as it unleashes her memories of her disgrace and undeserving grace then and now. Both chapters feature the verbs to remember in connection with the expression to be ashamed and to be confounded. Ezekiel 36:37 provides further explanation of Israel's eschatological restoration through the union of the entire house of Israel under God's sovereignty, as well as God's consideration of Jerusalem's sisters, namely Samaria and Sodom. Ezekiel's prophecy concerning the rehabilitation of the house of Israel and his vision of the bones in the valley appear to have in the background Jerusalem's encounter with Yahweh as a foundling in chapter 16 in response to the divine command, live. This is in vivid contrast to the parents' entreaties to the river god for their life as they abandon their unwanted child in the Mesopotamian ridden ceremony, thereby dramatically affirming Yahweh's enduring loving kindness for his chosen people whose Canaanite parents had forsaken them. The creative mandate reverberates rhetorically throughout Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones in Ezekiel 37, 6, 10, and 14, punctuated with the verb to live. Thank you.